The objective of this project is to analyze the process of economic convergence between India and Japan. Our group is composed by Alessio, Miquel, and Jorge. After 89 years of foreign occupation, the subcontinent of India finally regained its independence from the British Empire in 1947. Since then, the country's economic development has been largely dictated by socialist-inspired policies, such as state ownership of many different sectors. This meant slow growth, as for the next 3 decades India's GDP per capita would only grow at around 1% annually. It was not until the 1980s and especially the 1990s that it would slowly open up its markets through economic liberalization. In the following years, the country would transition towards a free market economy with a more rapid yearly growth. In order to be more thorough with our analysis of India's periods of convergence or divergence, we will compare it with one of the major regional economic powers, Japan. Japan became the first non-Western great power and expanded steadily until its defeat in the Second World War. When Japan recovered from devastation, it became the world's second largest economy behind the United States, and from 2010 behind China as well. From this same image, we can see that there are 2 main periods in India's recent economic history, from their independence until 1991, and from then until the present day. The first period, which is of divergence and takes place before liberalization, has its roots in the exploitative nature of India's colonial subjugation and their exposure to British Fabian socialism, which made them turn toward protectionism and socialism. There was a strong emphasis placed on import substitution industrialization, a trade policy that encourages replacing foreign imports with domestic products, economic interventionism, a large state-run public sector, business regulations, and central planning. Meanwhile, trade and foreign investment policies were relatively liberal. Jawaharlal Nehru was one of the key figures in the implementation of these ideas and served as the country's prime minister until 1964. The numerous 5-year plans during the start of this period resembled Soviet central planning, as many industries such as steel, mining, water, or telecommunications were nationalized. On top of this, a system of licenses and regulations known as the License Raj was introduced, which heavily impeded entrepreneurship and the running of businesses. By the 1960s, the concentration of resources towards fast industrialization left the farming sector quite weak. A subsequent combination of droughts, price rises, and the Sino-Indian War of 1962 led to a necessary change in the country. After Nehru's death in 1964, the new Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri believed India needed to move away from centralized planning and price control. He reinforced more investment on agriculture, accepted a larger role for private enterprises and foreign investment, and trimmed the Central Planning Commission's role. These reforms were especially welcomed after the new Prime Minister achieved victory in the Indo-Pakistani War of 1965. In the year 1966 and until 1969, India had to replace their 5-year plans with annual ones, as resources were scarce during this period. In short, the costly back-to-back wars with China and Pakistan and the economic shortcomings of the third 5-year plan meant that India's economy was severely weakened. This was also a year of political instability, as Prime Minister Shastri's death after only 2 years in office meant the election of a new left-leaning populist Prime Minister, Indira Gandhi. To combat this, Gandhi attempted a policy of economic liberalization coupled with a substantial devaluation of the rupee, 57%, which made it fall from 4.76 to 7.5 per US dollar, in an attempt to counter the country's significant balance of payments crisis. India's indifference towards foreign investment and neglect of its export sector meant it ran heavy trade deficits. The aim of the devaluation was to boost exports, but instead it accelerated inflation, which earned its widespread criticism and turned public opinion against liberalization.
In response, Gandhi nationalized 14 private banks in 1969, mainly to accelerate bank lending to agriculture in a time when a large majority of the credit flow was controlled by big businesses. This was a popular reform, as farm credit was boosted and lending to other priority sectors also increased. Eventually, though, these banks would become complacent and would compete to please their political representatives instead of focusing on funding projects. After the elections of 1977, the new Prime Minister Morarji Desai withdrew the highest legal tender status banknotes to combat illicit wealth, legalized strikes, and reinstated trade unions, all of which affected economic activity. The new Foreign Exchange Regulation Act was implemented, which stated that foreign investors could not own more than 40% in Indian companies. This resulted in some important multinationals shutting down operations in the country. With the start of a new decade came back an old Prime Minister. Indira Gandhi was re-elected in 1980. With her came some drastic measures to boost the economy and make it more competitive. Removal of price controls, fiscal reforms, a revamp of the public sector, reduction of import duties, delicensing of the domestic industry, etc. In essence, it meant the beginning of the end of the license raj. Combined with an increase both in external borrowing and government expenditure, the Indian GDP growth rate started to improve. During the 1980s, which would eventually become a transitional decade towards a new era, the investment to GDP ratio rose exclusively in the public sector, while it fell in the private one. Meanwhile, this external borrowing helped bridge the considerable gap between exports and imports, but it also led to a rapid accumulation of foreign debt. From this time, India started facing a balance of payment crisis. The second oil shock of 1979 pushed oil prices further up, which for India meant that the value of import almost doubled in the span of 2 years. From around 1980 to 1983, there was a global recession, and India's exports suffered greatly during this time. To offset the balance of payments crisis, a number of measures were taken, including external assistance in the form of loans and aids, withdrawal of special drawing rights, which is the currency of the International Monetary Fund, and borrowing from the same fund under the extended facility arrangement. During the mid-1980s, the balance of payments issue occupied a central position in India's macroeconomic management policy. The reforms of the 1980s, which were largely already in place by early 1988, can be broadly divided into 5 categories. Firstly, the open general license list was steadily expanded. The inclusion of an item into the list was usually accompanied by an exemption, which amounted to a reduction in import tariff on that item. Secondly, a decline in the share of canalized imports. Thirdly, several exporting incentives were introduced or expanded, especially after 1985. Fourthly, a relaxation of industrial controls, which, for example, included foreign exchange availability considerations, and also removing extra layers of regulation on imports. And finally, setting up of the exchange rate at a level that reduced the bias against traded goods relative to non-traded goods. But despite these measures, towards the end of the 1980s, external debt was rising. While the borrowing helped the economy grow, it was also pushing India towards a crash. As with external borrowing, high current expenditures within the country proved unsustainable. They manifested themselves in extremely large fiscal deficits. These factors led to a government that was not able to make repayments on its borrowing from abroad. The foreign exchange reserves, which were maintained to import petroleum and other essential resources, dropped to levels that were not sufficient to even last a fortnight. Furthermore, the crisis was worsened by the rising prices of essential goods. The culmination of these developments was the June 1991 crisis, which marked both the start of a new era of fast economic growth and of economic convergence with Japan. This period of economic convergence with Japan started with P.V. Narasimha Rao becoming Prime Minister in 1991 and launching a package of stabilization measures. They were short-term measures aimed at solving the immediate crisis. These included correcting the weakness which resulted in the balance of payments crisis and also included steps to bring inflation under control. India first approached the crisis through a devaluation of the rupee. The government, along with the Reserve Bank of India, devalued the rupee against major currencies by around 20% in order to make Indian exports more competitive. In addition, India received liquidity from the IMF to face the crisis. As part of the bailout, the IMF expected India to liberalize and open up the economy and to remove trade restrictions between India and other countries. Furthermore, the Soviet Union was collapsing during this time, proving to the world that socialism was a viable solution no more, as demonstrated also by China, in which Deng Xiaoping revolutionized it with a market-friendly reform. And so, Indian politicians turned in the direction of the market.
Liberalization was done in various sectors in the following ways. First, the regulation of industrial sector. In order to consolidate the gain already achieved during the 1980s and to provide greater competitive stimulus to the domestic industry, a series of reforms were introduced in the industrial policy. This proposes some massive changes in the way that India treated its industry and foreign investment, by moving away from the license regime. These policies aiming to achieve an easy entry and restructuring of business by facilitating merge and amalgamation. It ended the public sector monopoly in many industries, and it was restricted to only few relevant for national security, such as the military and energy. Second, financial sector reform. There was a reduction in the role of the Reserve Bank of India (RBI) from the regulator to the facilitator of the financial sector. This reform led to the establishment of private banks. Some currency exchange reform also took place. The market was then allowed to determine the foreign exchange rate. On third place, the introduction of a tax reform based on harmonization and reduction of corporate taxes was established in order to attract foreign investors, while it also simplified and reduced the general tax procedure. Finally, trade policy reforms. The main focus was on greater openness. Hence, the policy package was essentially an outward-oriented one. New initiatives were taken to create an environment which would provide a stimulus to export, while at the same time reducing the degree of regulation and licensing on foreign trade. All these changes made it easier to do business in India, and saw the lack of foreign goods and investment flooding the Indian market in the subsequent years. India's projections and conclusion. The economic reform initiated in 1991, followed by further measures undertaken by successive governments, have helped India emerge as one of the fastest-growing economies in the world. The foundation for a new era of development was laid by the Rao-Singh duo, which was built upon by successive governments. According to the first official estimate released by the Statistics Ministry, India's gross domestic product will grow 9.2% in the current fiscal year, the fastest since 1988, mainly due to a robust farm sector and a strong recovery in the manufacturing, construction and service sectors. In the coming year, India is set to regain its position as the world's fastest-growing major economy, and is likely to overcome Japan as Asia's second-largest economy by 2030, making India the second-largest economy in the Asia-Pacific region. Furthermore, the country's GDP is projected to surpass that of Germany and the UK, to rank as the world's number 3, only behind China and the United States.